Well, I must say I was both delighted and surprised to be asked to talk to David this evening. Delighted because I think it's a very good, interesting, readable, well-researched book. Surprised because a couple of years ago I wrote a book called How to Be Right, which advanced a conspiracy theory of my own, which is that everything that is wrong with the world is the fault of lefties and liberals, well, like David. And the opening entry in this A to Z of liberal left crimes was Aaronovitch, David, C, wrong about everything. And before the book was published, the lawyers at the publisher had a look at this, and they made me cancel it. They made me scrub it out and change it to something less offensive. And I said, why? You know, I mean, he's a lefty, he's got it coming to him. And they said, yes, but could you stand up in court and prove that David Aaronovitch was wrong about everything? Well, in the case of this book, I think he's very much not wrong about everything. I think he's absolutely right about 99.99% of things. For about half an hour, 40 minutes, I'm going to chat to David about the book, and then going to open open up for questions from the floor. If I could just say one thing, because we are talking about conspiracy theories, there is a danger, possibly, that some people might try to hijack the evening in one particular direction. If this happens, I shall take the Flight 93 option and charge the cabin and wrest the controls from whoever is dominating the proceedings, if that's okay. Right, so David, fantastic book, great fun. You seem to be suggesting that 9/11 was not the fault of Mossad or the lizard-headed Illuminati people. What is your crackpot theory as to actually what happened?
My counter-conspiracy theory, and can I say, incidentally, that if you were surprised to be asked to be chair, I was astonished that you were asked to be chair. But on reflection, glad about it as well. I mean, there was some kind of, and I did imagine a kind of weird conspiracy myself, which was, this is also, of course, the evening of the European Cup. And given that conspiracy theories are kind of famously male pastimes, I thought it was kind of a way of making sure that no men would actually attend. But of course, this sort of kind of crude characterization of fellow males is wrong. Your question is, of course, a deeply serious one. Indeed. You know, what makes us think that the thing that we think is most likely is the thing that actually happened? It's quite often said by 9/11 conspiracy theorists or 9/11 truthers, as they're sometimes self-called or other people call them, that actually the theory that Osama bin Laden was behind, or Al-Qaeda was behind 9/11 is itself a kind of some form of implausible conspiracy theory. And we can come later to the question of the business of evidence, of sorting out one bit of evidence from another. I mean, what is the evidence for Al-Qaeda's involvement, apart from Osama bin Laden's admission that it was Al-Qaeda, the attempts made by Al-Qaeda to do similar things in the past, and by Al-Qaeda linked individuals in 1993 to blow up the very same towers, except that time from the bottom rather from the top. Their belief that this was a fundamentally good thing to do as apart from being a fundamentally bad thing to do, the fact that a large number of people who later were seen in videos, testaments, etc., were actually seen getting on some of these planes, etc., etc., etc.
But apart from this circumstantial detail.
But apart from this circumstantial detail, which now corresponds to what we now know as, or what conspiracy theorists call the official version, apart from all the evidence there is that this is what happens, then it is just a conspiracy theory like any other. But that, of course, is what distinguishes one theory from another.
Do you have a theory, a conspiracy theory even, as to why it might be that such a high percentage of people actually believe this shit? I mean, JFK What was the percentage of the American population that?
Okay, and this is one where I have to kind of fess up, because one of the people who for a long time rather gently believed that kind of shit was me. I think it's fair to say that for my generation and political outlook, the belief that JFK was the victim of a conspiracy and not of a lone gunman was practically universal. I don't remember in all my early life meeting anybody who thought anything else. Now, that's not to say that I interrogated the facts at that stage. Of course, I didn't. I knew what one or two of the kind of mythical elements of the thing was supposed to be. The so-called magic bullet, the bullet that was supposedly impossible, for instance, which became the kind of deal breaker on the so-called official version, the version in the Warren Commission report. So, but I went along with it, and as I said, was a kind of passive enjoyer of it. Your favourite chapter, I know, is the one of the conspiracies that actually causes least damage, which is the whole Holy Blood, Holy Grail, Da Vinci Code stuff, from which, as far as I know, nobody's actually died. Well, I'm ashamed to admit that when those programmes were first on BBC Chronicle, and this is a long time ago and I was very young, the fact they were on a BBC history programme, and I didn't know enough then to have those sort of antennae that you have much later which prick up and say, hold on a second, Templars, you know, bloodline of Christ, and etc. And so I just thought, gosh, this is really incredibly interesting. And this is a really terrible thing. So I went out and bought the book. 500 pages of turgid nonsense, which was an absolute blockbuster bestseller, scooped the pool. The programmes were some of the best received documentaries that the BBC had ever put out. So when we say this shit, I have to own up to having had my significant moments of credulity as well. So one of the questions we could, this is the bigger kind of overriding question, is why, in a sense, these narratives, these stories can be so satisfying to people, and that's one of the things I tried to look at.
And there are a lot of publishers, of course, who make a lot of money out of this, from the Eric von Daniken stories, and also the TV channels. I mean, it wasn't that long ago, was it, that it was at the BBC or Channel 4 was giving Graham Hancock lots of airtime. So they are part of this conspiracy.
I mean, Channel 4 at one stage became a kind of arm of Graham Hancock's publishing operation. Robert Boval and all these kinds of people. And I think that's, this has happened right the way down from Immanuel Velikovsky through Erich von Daniken, all these kind of what you kind of might call sort of faux archaeology. Which sometimes have leached over in the bookshops from the New Age section. I mean, we know that New Age essentially means rubbish, okay? But it's, rubbish for people who kind of like sort of bits of, etc. Essentially part of the kind of aromatherapeutic world, okay, which is sort of kind of fun, it should be harmless and so on, but then kind of gets put over on the other shelves. And so you can sometimes find Graham Hancock in with the archaeology, despite the fact that a series of, and it's been incredibly lucrative. Those books are very well produced for those of you who've ever had any of them or got any of them, and they also self-sustaining. Once the thing becomes a success, then there's every reason why the publisher should publish another and give it high prominence. You go to the shop, you look at a book with high prominence, you see that it's got a documentary series on Channel 4, you think that this is something which has a degree of authority, and this word actually is going to be quite important to us. You imagine it has some degree of authority, and the story it tells, civilization is actually 10,000 years older than we thought it. The Sphinx is 10,000 years older than everybody thought. Or von Daniken, the archaeological structures we see on Earth are actually put there by spacemen. And look, here in a Mayan temple is a picture that looks incredibly like a spaceman on a space motorbike.
Well, it does a bit, you've got to admit, it does. I've seen those photographs. But it's annoying, isn't it, that I can't remember how many episodes were given over by Channel 4 to Graham Hancock's series, but then I think about it, 2 years later it ran this, an hour maybe documentary, exploding all the things that they'd previously said were true, and all these experts in their field who devoted their whole lives to things like researching the Sphinx and could say exactly how old the thing was and no, it wasn't as old as Graham Hancock made it. these people are getting absolutely nothing for what they do, and Graham Hancock is making millions.
Well, it's actually a point that you could make in a sort of different way about the internet, which is that the kind of first rush of what you might call sort of counter theory is given enormous sort of publicity. There was also an archaeological series called Test of Time, which I also bought the book of, actually, without realising that the chap who was involved was not actually a qualified Egyptologist, didn't really know, and was really running with a kind of flyer for which there was extremely little evidence indeed. But it's a bit like that on the internet as well. You know, because Google now has what you might describe as a kind of algorithm of desire, that's what comes up as the first few pages on Google. What you see kind of replicated is, in a sense, what a certain number of people are already desiring from the internet, and those will tend to be, in most of the fields, if you like, the conspiracy theories or the better narratives, as I sometimes call them, the narratives that are sort of more satisfying or that are more fun to tell.
So it's like Gresham's law, bad ideas drive out good.
They certainly do at the top, and you have to really search, and that's, I mean, part of the big problem for us in the, it's a challenge, and also something we should kind of arise to is, over the next 10, 15 years, is because I've embarked upon this information revolution, and whatever Simon Jenkins says, it is an information revolution. It is changing everything. The need for an education in discriminating between one source of information and another becomes very, very urgent. It becomes ever more urgent. It's something that we're kind of discussing, and it's kind of urgent in this field as well.
Yes, it was good, I must say, even though we are supposedly on different sides of the political divide, it's good to see you coming down at the end quite hard on relativism and postmodernism, which I think has got a lot to do with the prevalence of conspiracy theories in our times.
Well, I mean, there's a certain version of postmodernism, or kind of crude notion of what postmodernism is, that can lend itself to the belief that it doesn't matter whether something is actually true or not. And I do try and explore that in the book, why it is essential to try and take a stand around what you can tell the evidence says. I mean, if you want to look for a kind of local example, which I don't give quite so much, you can look for the impact of the entire MMR debate, in which a kind of preposterous doctor, a careless editor of Lancet, a series of useless journalists, and so on, and a pressure group, a rather ruthless pressure group, combined to cause what is very nearly a health disaster in Britain, out of nearly nothing, out of just about nothing.
I'm smirking guiltily here because I didn't give my kids MMR because of that.
Okay, we're all
and then
guilty.
we had to go to great expense to these clinics miles away where you had to give them one by one at great inconvenience and expense. And then towards the end we thought, oh, sod this, we'll just give them the MMR anyway.
Easily done.
So we all have been guilty in our time of falling for at least one or other conspiracy theories.
Oh, I don't know whether we all. I mean, there are probably people here who are far too sensible for any of them. But I mean, I certainly did. Yeah.
Is anyone here who has not believed ever in any conspiracy theory? There's one person, Mr. Posner. Well done. Congratulations to you, sir. Yes, it was good to see you revisiting the wonderful era of Hilda Morel and that whole spate of paranoia documentaries, of TV series like Bob Peck in Edge of Darkness and Defense of the Realm, where Gabriel Byrne gets blown up at the end by the shadowy forces of the government. Can you just tell us a bit about the Hilda Morel story?
Okay, first, I think this will be an age thing. Who remembers the case of Hilda Morel? Okay, so I think some explanation is in order here. You could maybe compare and contrast with David Kelly, because they're quite similar, I think. Sure. The case of Hilda Morel was an elderly woman who lived in Shrewsbury, and in 1984 she was murdered. She was abducted from her home. Her body was found some way away in a copse of woods. The police said it was a botched robbery. It began to emerge that Hilda Morel had two claims to political radicalism, or to be linked to political radicalism. The first was that she was a certified objector, which is what you had to be, at the Sizewell B inquiry about building a new nuclear reactor. The second was that her nephew had been in naval intelligence at the time of the sinking of the Belgrano, which was one of the kind of seminal events of the Falklands War in 1982. So the theory began to be developed that actually there was something shadowy about her killing. The police said that they didn't think there was, but they couldn't find anybody. And a series of theories began to be developed, which were held quite widely in 3 dramas, a novel, and so on, about how a section of freelancers employed by the security services were apparently too stretched financially to get their own people, had brought in these freelancers who had botched a job of trying to find out either, depending upon your taste, what her stuff was on Sizewell B, or the evidence about her nephew, and that she'd been killed as a result of this botched operation. And during the middle of this discussion, there was a World in Action suggesting that there were very deep, dark, disturbing questions to be asked. And for those of you who don't remember that, World in Action was at that time, along with Panorama, the prime investigative programme on British television in the days when British television had such things, which all seems quite a long time ago now, but nevertheless they did. Anyway, Tam Dalyell, Labour MP for Linlithgow, famous irritant to governments and so on, much loved on the left because he stands up in the House and says he has been privately told by sources he can't divulge that Hilda Morel was the victim of exactly this kind of a hit, and so on. Now, at the same time, round about the same time, there are a whole series, you've got to remember that at this time there's a time of maximum tension between East and West. Détente is more or less finished with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in '79. You have Ronald Reagan in the White House, you have Margaret Thatcher in Downing Street. A lot of people on the left and centre-left in both America and Britain are feeling kind of very left out. And there's an arms race going on. The Russians put in SS-20 intermediate range missiles into Eastern Europe, and the Americans are planning to put cruise and Pershing intermediate missiles in Britain, with the result that there's a resurgence of the campaign for nuclear disarmament. There's the Greenham Common camp. There's Heseltine campaigning against CND, and then there's the admission from an MI5 officer, Kathy Massiter, very famously on television, that CND is regularly infiltrated by the British security services. That's one element. At the same time in America, just before this business, you have the 3 Mile Island accident at the nuclear reactor, which happens at the same week that the film The China Syndrome opens. Not long after this, also, you have a series of books and then a film about an American worker for the nuclear industry, a woman called Karen Silkwood, who is killed supposedly when she's on the way to see the New York Times with some information they might
Only
like.
connect.
Only connect. And this situation gives rise to if you like, a kind of whole genre of TV drama and film drama. Edge of Darkness is the classic example, just re-released. Well worth seeing for a real prime example of mid-80s paranoia, very well done. Defence of the Realm with Gabriel Byrne, and they all have the same kind of thing, whistleblower. Stumbles upon, an ordinary person, maybe even rather cynical, stumbles upon something, finds out that there's a kind of secret nexus between the state, the Americans, and industry. It's always that, and so on, and gets bumped off at the end, but not before heroically letting everybody know what the situation is, because that's the kind of thing. And I think a lot of people actually began to believe that life was actually like that. Anyway, actually, I haven't cut a long story short. To cut a long story long, a cold case review of the Hilda Morel case in 2002, reviewing new DNA evidence, traces the DNA to a local farm labourer, who was 16 at the time and in a children's home, who is convicted of the crime in 2004. Case solved, and it really is solved. But interestingly, as far as I know, Tam Dalyell has never apologised for standing up in the House of Commons, or explained how he came to stand up in the House of Commons and say that he'd been given information by these sources. Well, he was certainly given information by somebody, but they were fantasists. And there are fantasists in the business.
But hearing you described that extraordinary chain of spooky coincidences, you can see why people with slightly overactive imaginations might prefer that version of reality to the rather humdrum one that a kind of casual weirdo wandering past decided to rape an 80-year-old woman. It's not as satisfying, is it?
It's not as satisfying, and I think it goes back to the psychology of the time as well, which was, as people on the left, the miners' strike obviously also happens in this period, 1984, 85. A lot of people on the left were feeling that they were very much sort of victims. You know, the Thatcher had made victims of us in some kind of way, that we were being got at. We were being described as the enemy within. And one of the ways of explaining our own kind of catastrophic political defeat to ourselves was to give the enemy sort of almost kind of demonic capacity. Yeah. And I see something very similar in the 9/11 movement, except on a more eccentric level. But then, of course, other people's conspiracy theories are always more eccentric than one's own. I mean, one of the interesting things is this: you find left-wing conspiracy theorists who are very, very cross to be lumped in with right-wing conspiracy theorists, because what they say is that their conspiracy theories are much more credible than the right-wingers' conspiracy.
Well, I mean, yes, when you were talking about the McCarthy trials, as a sound right-winger, I mean, I'm not a fan of McCarthy, but I was thinking, well, the Rosenbergs were selling secrets to the Russians, so it wasn't exactly a conspiracy theory, was it? I mean, you know, the left was doing bad shit.
No, but the thing is, it actually was a conspiracy theory, because what McCarthy said was, I have a list of 217 people in the higher echelons of government who are communists. Well, no such list existed, and they weren't. And this was kind of elaborated upon, so that the conspiracy was supposed to be that sections of the American government at the highest level had conspired to lose China to the communists. There was no such thing. Yeah. So in that sense, no matter how true it was that there had been communists who had been Russian spies, the conspiracy as outlined by McCarthy certainly never existed.
Yeah. Do you think that for a conspiracy theory to work properly, it needs a grain of truth, or do you think the less truth involved, the better?
No, it doesn't need a grain of truth at all. The one I start the book with is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion,
which is in a way the most dangerous conspiracy theory of the lot, because it explains both World War II and Islamism. Does it not?
Well, I mean, in many ways it does. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion is this document circulated mostly at the end of the First World War, originating with White Russians, which purports to be a kind of meeting of the chief Jews in the world. They've come together sometime round about the World Zionist Congress in Bâle in, I think, 1897, and so on. So it purports to be a record of it. And they talk about how they are going to effectively undermine the world by running all the political parties, by running all the newspapers, by getting pornography. I particularly like that one, by running pornography into the whole idea is to so undermine the established order, the established empires of Europe, that there will be war, and then revolution, then anarchy, and in the middle of this anarchy, people will search around for the higher truth, and the higher truth will be Judaism, so they'll all become Jews, and Jews will win, and etc., etc. Rather remarkable thing for quite a sort of exclusive group of people, as Jewish people have a tendency to be, but nevertheless, kind of notion that everybody will become it and then have world domination. The thing is that this was widely believed by middle-class people and students and professors and even newspapers in Europe in the period after the First World War. It was believed by Henry Ford, who put millions of dollars into circulating this kind of stuff. It was believed that it might be possible by the editor of the Times. The Times wrote an editorial about it in May 1920, saying, have we exchanged the prospect of a Pax Germanicum for a Pax Judaicum? You know, this kind of now, the Times covers itself in, recovers itself a bit because it's its reporter that discovers the real origin of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion when he's given the book upon which the Tsarist secret police some years earlier had used as a basis from which to create it, and can therefore show that it's show its provenance. But this isn't sufficient, of course, for many people in Germany, and the Protocols becomes therefore one of the major weapons of the Nazis. It's used in education. But what's very interesting about it is, well, so it's described by Norman Cohn, the historian, as a warrant for genocide. It gives people the excuse that they need. But the thing about the protocols is it is regularly cited even now in Arab countries. I found a copy on Brunei International Airport, believe it or not, which is an Islamic country. So it's also sort of, has kind of traction in even at the most ordinary level in Islamic countries. It's widely touted, often on Iranian television, and of course is part of the Hamas Charter. Actually, is referred to in the Hamas Charter. So, it shows you the capacity for even what we would now regard as a super ludicrous conspiracy theory to have sufficient, mutation, and well, actually it hasn't even mutated that much. That's what's funny about it, but to be able to move from one place to another and cause trouble.
Yes, I mean, you don't go enormously on this thing in the book because there's enough there. It's interesting enough. We don't need to. Doesn't need to be any longer than it is. But I was wondering whether you could expand a bit on that. The fact, for example, that so many Muslims in Britain at the moment still believe that 9/11 was a conspiracy by MI5, and don't believe that Muslims were responsible for 9/11.
Yeah, I mean, that's just a regrettable truth. There is a fairly widespread conspiracism of that kind.
I mean, a majority, indeed, I think. Is that?
I can't speak to whether or not it's a majority. I honestly don't know. I mean, I don't know of any particular poll. I know there are some polls taken about whether or not 9/11 was an inside job, and I don't know whether it was a majority. I honestly can't remember. But nevertheless, it's a significantly higher proportion than the population overall. And with 9/11 conspiracy theory, for instance, I mean, my colleague. Or a colleague of mine, Anatol Lieven, was reporting from Pakistan just 3 weeks ago that the widespread belief in Pakistan that 9/11 was an inside job was actually quite a significant barrier to taking action, mobilizing action against the Taliban in the Swat Valley, up until the period when the Taliban, of course, made it essential for the Pakistani government to act.
Well, this would chime with one of the things you say in your book, which is that conspiracy theories are history as written by the losers, that whoever feels that their history is not on their side makes up this stuff to justify their position.
There's an element to that. I mean, there is an element of that, which is that, let's take Pearl Harbour. There's a huge American movement against the Second World War. Up until Pearl Harbour. It's forgotten here now, just what a kind of close run thing, the question of whether or not, even before that happened, America would give significant aid to Britain once war had broken out with Germany, and even at the time when it looked as if Britain might actually be defeated and invaded. Even then, it was touch and go as to whether or not Britain would get significant aid. America had signed up to a series of neutrality acts because of its experience in the First World War. They were determined not to repeat it. There were a lot of people then who said that had been a conspiracy to get America into the First World War by the armaments manufacturers and bankers and so on. And if they wanted to go that step further and ask what kind of race the armaments manufacturers and bankers belonged to, then some of them were only too happy to do that, as I've suggested. But anyway, they're a very powerful movement. And by and large, although they lose out on things like Lend-Lease just to Roosevelt, nevertheless, there's a strong feeling that America itself won't be drawn into a war. And then along comes Pearl Harbour. And this destroys the America First movement, absolutely destroys the isolationist movement in the United States overnight. Now, as you get towards the end of the war, 1944, there begin to be demands which are sort of backed by the Republicans, who've had enough of losing elections to Roosevelt, which they have done now continuously since 1932, to look at the Pearl Harbour case again. In the first instance, there's a suggestion of government incompetence. Now, this begins to change into the idea that just possibly it was provocation, that Roosevelt had provoked the Japanese. And this gradually also changed over the years to to the proposition that the American military had broken not just the diplomatic code that the Japanese had, but they had also broken the Japanese naval code, and that therefore not only did Roosevelt provoke the Japanese, but not only did he have an idea that an attack was coming, he knew exactly where it was coming, he knew it would attack Pearl Harbor, and decided not to tell the American forces at Pearl Harbor about it and to allow the Japanese attack to happen. Gore Vidal is a famous proponent of just this theory, as it happens,
but he's dead now, which is a bit sinister, isn't it?
Who?
Gore Vidal, isn't he?
Well, as far as I know, he's still alive.
Oh, is he? Oh, my God.
No, he's not very well.
All right.
But let's not exaggerate.
He may have been poisoned by the intelligence people.
Well, he could have been. One of the things that we can notice by this, incidentally, is how very, very rarely conspiracy theorists are killed. Which, given that you have the kind of secret truth, is. But I don't wish that upon them. But nevertheless, you can see here how a defeat is gradually rationalised by a section of the defeated as being as being the product of deliberate skullduggery.
Now, before we open the questions to the conspiracy wackos on the floor,
you're just trying to charm them all, aren't you?
I'm just trying to charm them. May I invite you to read your funniest joke? No, there's a very, very funny bit, one of the many funny bits in the book, where David talks about. Sorry, I'm setting it up now. I'm setting you up for a fall, aren't I, mate? I'm sorry.
That's right. What's funny about that? That's the funniest bit.
It is my favourite conspiracy, which is the one about the Holy Blood, Holy Grail, Holy Shit, as he calls it. And he's talking about how the people who wrote that book, what was the book called?
Bagent, Lee, and Lincoln.
Yes. How they sort of obfuscate the historical detail and how they came to their conclusions, and that bit there.
They've had a problem with the invented organisation, the Priory of Zion, which is that it's been admitted that it doesn't exist.
Small detail.
That's right. And actually, those of you who've read Foucault's Pendulum by Umberto Eco have a sort of very nice kind of insight into this. And I say about them, they had an almost heroic way of fending off evidence of the Priory's real origins. This is how they put it in The Messianic Legacy, published in 1987. One wonders if their counsel had read this passage before the Dan Brown trial. And this is what they said. Nothing appeared straightforward. Nothing could be taken at face value. Everything had an alternative explanation. The Prieuré de Sion had begun to seem to us like a holographic image, shifting prismatically according to the light and the angle from which it was viewed. From one perspective, it appeared an influential, powerful and wealthy international secret society, whose members included eminent figures in the arts, in politics, in high finance. From another perspective, it seemed a dazzlingly ingenious hoax devised by a small group of individuals for obscure purposes of their own. Perhaps, in some fashion, it was both. And then I write, and perhaps Lincoln, Bagent and Lee are in some fashion a group of Zulu women from the high veld. Well, because it does come...
Just one point I noticed there, the holographic image, which David Shayler, the ex-MI5 man, believed was what happened on 9/11 when missiles cloaked in a holographic aeroplane-shaped image. Is that right?
Yes, so that's what he said.
Is David Shayler here?
No, David Shayler. I mean, alas, David Shayler has had the revelation that he is God. And I'm not joking here, so he's a slightly sad case, really.
Like David Icke?
Yes. So those of you, of that disposition, we're now going to have to choose between them. Because I suspect they can't both be right. No.
So, shall we open the questions to the floor? Yes, you, sir. Oh, sorry, yes.
Oh, yeah. It's only because it's been filmed.
Oh, right. That's a good
by the intelligence services.
If superstition actually ruled the Middle Ages and up to the 18th century and scientific rationality started to reduce its power, is conspiracy theory taking the place of superstition as a ruling part of our life?
I think that's actually a really good question. I mean, in the sense that Yeah, and I think actually there's a degree of truth in this respect. I think that on the whole, the thing about conspiracy theories are that they are better stories. They're better stories than reality. I think particularly, the JFK would be a very good example. The Princess Diana one, you have this overarching... If we think about Princess Diana as a princess story, let's say, and we have the sort of shy, blushing girl, we then have the fairy tale wedding, we have the two sons, etc. Then we have the first inklings that things aren't quite right. Then we have the Andrew Morton book, which tells us that it's all gone wrong, and he's a cold husband. And then we get the wrinkle on the cold husband, which is that we get the antipathetic in-laws, which comes up to the panorama with they don't want me to be Queen of England. You remember that kind of bit. But then she finds love again, and then car accident. It's not a good story. It's not a good ending. It's not. It's like Rapunzel, let down your hair before the prince gets anywhere near. She falls out of the tower. It's no good. I mean, it's just not satisfactory. And so the ending that somehow or other these wicked in-laws were the people who had her bumped off, then followed maybe in one's own mind with the idea that they are then exposed for what they've done, gives you an absolutely full and much better story arc and a much more satisfying. So I think it is true that what conspiracy theories have going for them, by and large, is that they are better stories, conforming more to the sort of stories that we like to tell ourselves, and which are therefore away from the kind of messy reality of our own stories, where our own lives are actually, slightly pointless. I mean, I don't mean your life is pointless, but I mean nobody kind of gives them a shape. They don't describe great narratives on the whole, and increasingly don't. So we look for something better. So in that sense, you could say that there is something similar about that to the process of religion. If you're not religious, you might, or even if you are religious, you might accept that, and to superstition.
Who's that? Yes, that chap there.
I'm very intrigued by the sort of creativity and ingenuity of people who devise these things, and I was interested in you talking a little bit about that, about how you feel about the people who actually come up with these. And one particular example, which I don't know if you come across, which is the re-explication of the Mohammed al-Dara video. I don't know if you've looked at that on the web.
This is the boy who was shot in crossfire between the Israelis and some Palestinians that famously shot. I just don't know enough about that. I mean, I'm aware that there have been claims about it. I mean, but you raise a really interesting point, which is the incredible level of detail. I mean, with most of these theories, in a sense, I had to earn the right to be able to say that they were wrong. And it took me 6 years to get through quite a lot of this stuff. I mean, take the kind of 9/11 theories. They have been added to, subtracted from, added to. There's always a new addition. I mean, and there's some very nice 9/11 truth people who follow me around. Well, actually, of the 5 of them, 2 of them are nice and 2 of them are very cross, and so on. So maybe they can learn their techniques from the intelligence services themselves, and so on. But there will always be, if you say, right, the thing you asked me last time, this is the answer to it. They say, oh, nobody believes that anymore. What about this? And it's absolutely extraordinary how they will find a Danish scientist who no one has ever heard of before, who they say says that they have now found traces of explosive at the site. And what do I think of that? And you begin to chase it back, and you find out that this man is not necessarily terribly expert, that actually he hasn't said that he has found it, he said that he might have found it, and that also the thing that he said he might have found, not everybody agrees it even exists, and that the samples he looked at have been contaminated by being in people's lofts for 8 years. But you have to do all that work to discover it, and so on. So there is a kind of, and if you look at the Holy Blood, Holy Grail, for instance, there is an absolutely extraordinary commitment to inventing rubbish there. And to finding kind of connections in rubbish. I mean, they say that they posit the notion backwards from everything that the wife of Jesus Christ, pregnant, found her way to the shores of France. That the bloodline of Christ that was thus established was guarded by some secret organisation till this bloodline becomes the Merovingian dynasty in France, which is then superseded 200 years later by the Carolingians, at which point it metamorphoses into the dukedom of Lorraine and is then guarded by this priory of Zion, including Jean Cocteau and Leonardo da Vinci and Isaac Newton and various other people who kind of take it. And it just this is an incredible level of they've done an extraordinary level of reading of other bits of rubbish in order to get there, and so on. And yes, there is a kind of commitment to establish these theories, which is really dramatic. I mean, and a lot of people, some of the people who are conspiracy theorists, like the 9/11 people, are as active and as committed and as totally sincere as any party political activist or any activist for any other kind of organisation. There's not... The one thing I don't on the whole discover in this is very much insincerity.
Gentleman at the end.
I wonder if one of the reasons why you can't ever defeat somebody who believes in a conspiracy is because you're not arguing with them on an intellectual level, but actually it's an emotional level. They have an emotional need to explain the inexplicable, to explain the deep, dark fears, the bogies in the cupboards. And I wonder if you mentioned storytelling. I think there's a long history of oral storytelling, and I think there may be, for conspiracy theorists, a sort of combination of a desire to explain the inexplicable with a nice story that meets their emotional needs. And that's why it's so hard for you to construct an intellectual argument to knock down their theories, because they will always replace it with another theory because it supports where they come from to explain the inexplicable. Do you think that's a possibility?
Yeah. I do, although I don't give up kind of hope on this one, because actually, of course, as I pointed out, people who believe in conspiracy theories are not sort of strange other creatures. They are just ourselves in sort of different moments. And, as with the MMR thing, people who suddenly begin to have doubts at a certain moment and so on. I'm not talking about the people who necessarily kind of propagate it in a big way, but certainly those... I mean, the first thing to say is that certain kind of conspiracy theory telling is about the pleasure of telling the story. I mean, part of my kind of base reason for wanting to do all this was to give people like me who found ourselves in dinner parties or in the pub with the guy, and it always is the guy, who tells us, did you know? But, actually, the ammunition to say, well, no, actually, for once. Because what would always happen is that you'd say, well, I'm really not sure that can be true. Oh, yeah, I've got all the evidence. Here's the 5 key kind of facts. And, of course, you're right, you don't have the answers there to the 5 key facts. Well, hopefully this sort of partially deals with that. In this sense, for instance, when I was working on the book and went back over the Kennedy stuff, I discovered things that I had never really thought about, like the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald had in April 1963 already tried to assassinate somebody using the same rifle in Dallas, had actually only narrowly missed. Well, that's a bit of a kind of important thing, really, to know that about it. The next thing is to have, when you see what's become more possible recently, computer reconstruction using the exact locations of the book depository, where Kennedy sat in the car relative to Governor John Connolly, just above, Connolly slightly below him, and inboard to the left. The so-called magic bullet, which they always said was an impossible thing, which we always told us impossible. No bullet could have done that. Actually, not only can it have done that, but the magic bullet actually doesn't look magic at all. It looks like a very sensible kind of a bullet. Well, once you know those two things, you don't need a conspiracy theory anymore. There's no need to be more complex than the conspiracy theory, because all you really need to reflect upon is the bad luck, in a sense, that managed to route the Kennedy motorcade past the book depository where worked somebody who'd already tried to off somebody a few months earlier, and such things unfortunately do happen in life. So actually, when you know that, when you get a kind of casual conspiracy, I mean, it's true in a way. I mean, as a Labour Party MEP, he'd been the head of he'd been the chief of the Labour group in MEPs. And I told him I'd been writing this book, and he said, you know, but, you know, you do believe in some conspiracy theories. And I said, well, increasingly, actually, I don't. And he said, well, what about Diana? I said, no, certainly not Diana. He said, but he said, you're not going to tell me. He said, you're not going to tell me. He was actually serious, that JFK was not the victim of a conspiracy. And I said, well, I think I probably am. He said this, nothing you or anybody else could ever say would ever persuade me that it wasn't a conspiracy. Nothing. So I think that speaks. It certainly is. And I said to him, all right, I said, but what I'm getting back from you is not, if you like, a kind of, you know, an evidence-based thought or a series of things about what had happened. What I'm getting back from you is a determination to hang. I mean, and some people can say, yes, you're generally right about conspiracy theories, but this conspiracy theory that I particularly like and have held on for a long time, that's true. And if you say it's not true, you're a bastard. And I get quite a lot of that, actually.
I think you might be a bastard.
Yeah, well,
Lady over there, young lady over there. We haven't had a girl yet, so I think we have to have her.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I'm interested in the relationship between conspiracy and conspiracy theory. So, for example, I'm thinking of the attempted assassination of the Castro with a cigar, I believe, and also the overturning of Allende. Now, would those be considered conspiracies, or are they just plots? There are certainly things that happened with conspiring behind them. And how does that relate to conspiracy theory?
yeah.
Is conspiracy theory only theory when it's unfounded, or is there a theory if it actually is realized?
I think that's the really essential question, actually, which is, of course, there are such things as conspiracies, in the sense that people get together and plot secret things that they don't want other people to know about, and sometimes that they don't want other people to know that they've done, which may not be the same thing, if you see what I mean. And bank robberies are conspiracies. Secret agencies are practically always conspiring because everything they do, or almost everything they do, is secret. Daniel Pipes, the American author, said that conspiracy theory was a conspiracy that didn't happen. And I find that very kind of unsatisfactory. So this is when I thought about it, this is what I felt defined it. I say that a better definition of conspiracy theory might be the attribution of deliberate agency to something that is more likely to be accidental or unintended. And as a sophistication of this definition, one might add the attribution of secret action to one party that might far more be reasonably explained as the less covert and less complicated action of another. So a conspiracy theory is the unnecessary assumption of conspiracy when other explanations are more probable. And that's what I think would define a conspiracy theory. There's no doubt that, for instance, at certain times it was decided to try and conspire to kill Castro using other people. One of the things that's interesting is how unsuccessful that was as against, let's say, having lone gunmen kill presidents, which has proved to be a relatively more successful and has happened several times in American history. In other words, conspiracies are actually fairly difficult when they're complex to do, but not impossible, because after all, 9/11 itself was a conspiracy. You know, I mean, it's not as if they walked onto the plane and said, "It's 4 tickets, please, to go on the Boston plane. We intend to crash it into the thing, and here's my bolt cutter." You know, it was pretty kind of secret, and they conspired to do it. So, but as I said, it is at a level of complexity beyond anything which we sort of meet in common sense or everyday life, that, let's say, George Bush, who did consider the 9/11 attacks as being the most terrible and disgusting attack on American territory, as being more likely to do it than Al-Qaeda, who thought that such an attack was actually one of the best things you could possibly do.
Could another explanation for the reason why people turn to conspiracy theories? I have been called a truther by my brother, and I don't really believe in the 9/11 truth movement, but some of the things that made me feel a certain way was simply because I didn't understand how something could have happened, and there wasn't enough of an explanation. So it wasn't that I believed necessarily there was a conspiracy, I just wanted someone to explain something. I mean, for example, something that comes out, well, the Pentagon and the lack of plane and the Building 7, just when you see the news, there isn't a tail or wings, and thus you just want an explanation. And when the investigation took a couple of years to come to fruition, that lag time can, I think, lead perfectly sane people to actually think, well, I just want an explanation.
This also is a very good point, particularly in the era of the internet. A number of things happen. Let's take 9/11 for instance. The first thing is to say is that we all know what happened in terms of, or everybody except David Shaler knows what happened. Okay. So we now think of it as inevitable. It's a tendency we all have. But actually, at the moment when it was happening, it wasn't inevitable at all. It was one of many, many possibilities about what could be happening there. That's why all flights into and out of the United States were stopped, which is why public buildings were guarded here in London, despite the fact that there was, it turned out, no threat. We didn't know that at the time, and so on. So one of the things you really have to do is distinguish between what you knew now, what you know now, and what you knew then. The second thing is that the first media reports of something happening are very, very confused. Having been a journalist for a long time, I can tell you that you're grabbing at pieces of information and trying to get them either onto the air or onto the newspaper, and you're also looking all the time for what the clue might be and so on. In other words, they can be fairly inaccurate, and something that conspiracy theories often do is pick up on the gaps between what that day's report or the next day's report by a journalist says and what actually then turns out to be nearer the case, and that's very important as well. The third thing is that it takes nearly no time to create a notion of an anomaly, but it takes much more time to explain it once the notion of the anomaly has been created. Largely because the people who have to explain it are busy doing other stuff, like guarding us against other possible terrorist attacks that they might think are coming, and partially because their mills grind very small, whereas the conspiracist mill grinds very, very, very big. In other words, you can stick a theory out there in no time with no evidence. So let's take the Pentagon as a classic example. Within weeks of the 9/11 attacks, a guy called Thierry Meyssan has published a book in France, which is the origins of the theory that a plane didn't hit the Pentagon. Okay. He gives all kinds of reasons as to why this is. The hole in the Pentagon isn't plane-shaped, as if what happens is like out of a Tom and Jerry cartoon, where kind of Tom goes through the brick wall, leaving even his whiskers in kind of profile and so on. And then they make all kinds of assertions like there's no wreckage, etc., etc., etc. Here are the facts as they then become established. There was wreckage. There are pictures of the wreckage, including recognisable pieces of that aircraft's design on the lawn of the Pentagon just after the crash. The DNA of the passengers who were in the plane was found inside the Pentagon. We have seen pictures of and the discovery of the engine parts from that particular make of plane discovered from within the Pentagon. And to add to that, as if that wasn't enough, there were hundreds of eyewitnesses that saw the plane go into the Pentagon, even identifying what kind of model plane it was. And still, there is a belief that somehow or other they were all wrong, it wasn't quite right, and so on. But you're right in a way. 2 months after the Pentagon was attacked by a plane that everybody had seen, they weren't going to spend an awful lot of time and man-hours chasing down these ridiculous theories in order to refute them when there was other stuff to be getting on with. So that's why it took at least a couple of years for organisations like Popular Mechanics and the people who run some websites like 9/11 Myths to actually begin the business of refuting conspiracy theories, because the refutation of conspiracy theories is very nearly a full-time job, and it's not one on the whole that you want your security agencies wasting their time with. It's the sort of thing you can have people like me wasting my time with, because it doesn't matter if I waste my time.
Should we have two more and you can choose? I don't want the responsibility.
I can choose. That's not sharing, that's total irresponsibility.
Yes. I don't want to see their sad little faces when I reject them. That's the
Who
thing.
do you think's been laughing?
I don't know, we can probably have more than two anyway.
Okay, go on.
Just, if there's a few more. There's a lot of pointing going on there.
Oh, yes, that's right. Probably relations going on there.
Do you think that rationality is the best way to fight these? I mean, you've had experience. Does a rational argument actually shut them up? Or maybe in the way that if you sit next to someone who has a fault of that you share, which is worse than yours, it quite often makes you look at yourself. So if you came up with an argument perhaps more lunatic than theirs, maybe saying, well, I sliced a tomato this morning and it had Osama bin Laden's head in it, and that told me, you know, or the day after.
Careful, it'll be on the website the next morning.
Well, you know.
Do I think that
I mean, can you defeat them, or is it just best to humour?
I mean, there is the kind of element of combativeness in me that thinks about sort of defeat and so on and enjoys that prospect. But actually, it may not be the right way of looking at it, because I'm also defeating myself partially in this. I think that there is quite an important counter movement underway at the moment, and I give myself the conceit of being part of it. Another part of it would be, let's say, what Ben Goldacre is doing in Bad Science and so on, which is to attempt to kind of row back from the proliferation of bad theory and bad science and bad reporting to get to the stage where, if you like, the true skeptic, which is a different cast of mind altogether, has their shout as well and sort of enters the competition for the public ear and so on. And Ben chaired one of these sessions with me in London 2 weeks ago, and he was much more pessimistic than me, despite the fact that his book is now an absolute runaway surprise bestseller. It really, really is. And actually, I have to say, this book's doing well, because a lot of publishers thought this book wouldn't do very well, because they thought only books saying conspiracy theories were true would sell. And so I think I think there's a movement. I think the kind of anti-stupid and skeptics movement is kind of well underway, and here you all are.
What is your viewpoint on the rising sitegeist movement and the documentaries on the internet?
The rising
Sitegeist movement.
Oh, zeitgeist movement. You're thinking about things like loose change. Yeah. Yeah. One of the things about the internet and so on, which is very democratic, is it blurs the distinction between what comes, if you like, out of a reputable and official source and what comes out of a sort of like a citizen source. And sometimes that's a good thing and sometimes it's not, and it's very difficult to tell when it is. So you get a documentary like Loose Change, which is made for very little money, largely because, you know, the people in it are students and therefore don't require a huge amount of money to keep going. They pirate stuff, you know, the music, or indeed sometimes even have it compose it themselves. They take the images from anywhere they want, and they're very adept in the medium, and they're very, very good at putting images together and editing, because they absolutely belong to the generation that has gone way beyond pop videos and so on, but that understands almost kind of instinctively how these images work together. And these are very, very kind of powerful. They become very powerful artifacts. I think, actually, in a way, Michael Moore is a sort of forerunner of this, and shows how quickly it adapts. Michael Moore is fabulously partisan. He's fabulously unscrupulous in a way in how he intercuts. You know, any documentary maker can see it sort of coming a mile off, but if you're not a documentary maker, you're just impressed by the kind of power of it and so on. And I think that is kind of problematic, really, because you don't have. It's like in a way being in a class with a mimic. You know, it doesn't matter that you might be a better person than the mimic. The fact that the mimic has got your voice off to a T clobbers you every single time. I mean, you're buggered really one way or another, and it's a bit like that. It feels a bit like that. However, what I think is coming is a moment whereby you then get counter films that point out. I mean, they'll take a little bit more, but they also have fun, sort of pointing out how ridiculous these things are. Is I kind of hope that's what's going to happen.
David, an ex-World in Action person, in having done a lot of investigation, one of the things that always crops up with these kind of conspiracy theories is UFOs. The one thing that keeps cropping up time after time. Is it military? Is it extraterrestrial? And it's going on forever. I mean, I don't know whether it's in your book, but I mean, it's something that is part of the conspiracy theory. And, you know, we'd love to learn what's been going on about it all.
One of the big problems, obviously, that I faced was, because one of the reasons why the book took so long was I had to have some kind of cut-off points. And I decided to leave the extraterrestrials to something else, to somebody else to deal with. But it often comes up in this form, which is there been a conspiracy to hide our contact with? And there've been any number of films that have posited this as a possibility. It's a bit like, you know, the way this book started, which was with somebody telling me the theory about the moon landing not having happened, and him not being aware that there had been a Hollywood movie that had said exactly that in '78. You know, now this whole kind of thing is sort of indistinguishable, if you like, from the films that have been made about it. And so you can't really tell whether what we've got is things that have actually happened, or things that people have seen in movies and then dreamt, or almost think are memories. But I'll make this point that I didn't realise, I was told, but apparently is the case. Something like 80% of the people who say that they have been the victims of alien abduction are women. It's obviously the case from everything that I've seen, every experience, and book signings where women come up and say, could you please sign this for my husband, brother, uncle, son, etc., that the vast majority of people who believe in conspiracy theories and replicate them are men. And you kind of puzzle about why this might be. And my theory is that conspiracy theories are also sort of hysteria for men. An alien abduction is a bit of a sort of hysteria for women. It's the projection of inner problems onto a kind of onto your own kind of physical world, which is, you know, I am being abducted. Men who are sort of more used to the notion of being, you know, of projecting themselves onto the organisation of the world, project out in terms of or have tended to project out in terms of conspiracy theories. But I stress, to say that is conjectural kind of does violence to the certainty of conjecture. I have no evidence for it. I just kind of think it.
Yeah, there's a lot of photographic evidence that used to be issued about UFOs. And all of a sudden, every camera, every video camera, there's no visual evidence of UFOs for like 10, 15 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think UFOs were a fashion. And that actually, that's very true. I think the UFOs were a fashion that has gone. People aren't interested. Just like Loch Ness Monster has had its kind of period of ban. Its photographs have appeared, and it's people who swear that they have seen it have appeared, and the notion that the government is trying to cover it up in order to either preserve it or, you know, etc., has appeared. And these things kind of follow, you know, because the fact is, extraterrestrials being out there is for many people a better story than them not. Or rather than the story, we just don't know, and we may never know whether or not there are other kind of beings out there. It's not as good a story as there are, and they've been in contact. Oh, and certainly not as good a story as they are. They've been in contact, and they've been in contact with me and my bottom. Because the amount of anal probing that goes on during alien abduction is
extraordinary, isn't it?
Yes, it certainly is suggestive. Yeah, crop circles were a fashion. And in fact, crop circles is a good example of what you were saying earlier. Despite the fact that the people who did the crop circles owned up to doing the crop circles, there are still people who believe they're lying.
I'd like to know what you think should be done in the information age with YouTube and whatever. What should be done to educate, in particular, children in how to respond to these sorts of challenges?
Okay. This is a kind of really serious question. I'll try and answer it fairly briefly. I chaired a discussion at the British Library about 3 weeks ago where they were looking at the digitising of an enormous amount of their archive, including the digitising of all PhD theses submitted in this country going back to 1700, if you can imagine. But the general issue was coming up about what we were going to do with what greater attitude we should take towards, and there were lots of people from universities and so on. And the question arises about whether or not we shouldn't find ways of creating a sort of a body on the internet which is kite marked, which has some form of peer review. It doesn't say that everything else is rubbish. It just says that we can vouch for the information within this kind of section, whether we aren't going to have to begin to do that. Subject to absolutely constant review all the time and challenge all the time, but nevertheless something of that sort. I think that may have to be part of the long-term answer. I don't sort of go into that in the book, but it's just a sort of another interest. The microphone taken away from you.
I was interested in what you said about the interpretation of coincidence.
Of
coincidence.
Of coincidence.
Responding to the conspiracy theory, and how you talked about the truth. And I wonder whether, if we are embedded in a culture or in a society that requires us to dramatize on anything, and whether media perhaps help us to do that, or maybe the internet, or we all read novels. And so what is imaginary and what is truth? So I'm kind of passing on the question, what is truth and why do we have to dramatize it, perhaps?
Yeah. The playwright David Mamet looked at, as one of the things, at the need we have for drama. And he pointed out that it was quite interesting how we'd have drama on television in the evening. As almost as he says, we will, he said, have drama in that spot. You know, either through the soap or something. We will have the story before we go to bed. We will have the book at bedtime. We will have, you know, it helps to make the day complete. The immersion in the narrative and so on, the desire for it is so ingrained. And we know, actually, at that level, that these stories are not true. You know, we know that they might have a kind of metaphorical truth, but they're not literally true. But obviously, if they're so satisfying, then we will also seek to appropriate story for other events as well. In a way, how could we not? How could we not? And if the events are not satisfactory, then we will reshape the events sometimes to become satisfactory. And of course we do that. And I'll give you a classic example of that, which we can all relate to. But I hadn't noticed it until a friend of mine, who's a psychoanalyst, pointed it out to me. And all doctors know this to be the case. People always know where they have picked up a disease or a cold. It's amazing how people will always have a story. I got the cold here, I picked it up there. You know, they will always have a story. Actually, it corresponds to nothing. They have no idea where they caught it. You know, they know kind of roughly, but they don't know where. But actually, we will have a backstory for it. If you think about children, how they create alternative parents for themselves, other than the shitty parents that they've got, or the disappointing parents that they've got, and say, you know, oh no, you're not my real parent. Prince Charles is my real father, or something like that. All kind of, often you get small children will say this. They kind of construct a better story for themselves about who they are and where they come from, and so on. So I think your point is absolutely true. However, the business of growing up is quite often sorry?
But what is true at this point?
Well, I mean, actually, we do make judgments about what is true, don't we? All the time, we have to, which is the problem in a sense with the kind of, you know, a real relativist prospectus. We make decisions about the truth of crossing the road out there. You know, we make decisions all the time on that basis, and also when we're parents, we begin to get a very close relationship to the truth, because actually we're trying to guide our children, real children, for whom we have real responsibility through a real world, and all of a sudden relativism actually becomes much less important to us. I often think that relativist academics can only be people who either don't have or don't spend enough time with their kids.
Don't you think one of the factors here is the fact that we're not always told the truth by politicians? And if you look at things like extraordinary rendition, torture, if you look at Obama's just revelations recently that actually torture did happen, weapons of mass destruction, do you not have some sympathy for people who might be grappling with things when they don't know what the truth is?
Yeah, I mean, clearly yes, must be the answer to that. I think, you know, although in a way, well, yes and no, because of course they also know that they themselves lie. And a lie is not the same as a conspiracy. The other fact is that sometimes you're not lied to. I mean, after all, it is not that Dick Cheney disguised his view about waterboarding, or Rumsfeld disguised his view as about being made to stand, and so on, particularly. What was about to happen was in many ways kind of rather well prefigured by the way in which people talked about it beforehand. But yes, but if you're asking me, does let's say government duplicity or lack of truth-telling do everything? I mean, because there's a very interesting book by a woman called Catherine Olmsted, which has just come out, which is about conspiracy theory in America. Came out about a month before my book. And my criticism of hers is that she casts almost everything in terms of a reaction to government action. Her book's purely set in America. But actually, if you look at the conspiracy theories that I've looked at, they don't have that common feature. Some of them do, an awful lot of them don't, which suggests that actually the roots of conspiracy lie somewhere else. But if you're asking, say, are you likely to have a kind of upsurge of belief in something like 9/11 after an episode like Iraq, where governments say that something exists, they believe something exists, for it to be discovered that it doesn't, then I don't think it is so surprising that some people who might otherwise not be tempted down those routes do go down those routes.
I think this is the last one, I think. Okay. Yep.
I better be good then.
Yes.
One of the things I think that also that fuels all of this is people's fantasies are much stronger than the reality, and I mean, hence that's where madness lies, of course. And you know, in all these theories, you know, really what you're describing is just reality just gets crushed essentially, and it's not just where madness lies. And I imagine you have a lot to say about this in your book, but it's actually not just kind of funny stories, but potentially quite dangerous because it fuels people's paranoias, their fears, hatred, all sorts of kind of very, very serious implications. And I think, you know, the idea that people sit around and have a laugh about conspiracy theories, and perhaps what doesn't get discussed or addressed enough is really this is where madness lies, and it can be potentially quite dangerous.
It can. I mean, the first thing I say is, one thing which I say is that reality is maddening. Reality is difficult, contingent, messy, very often unpleasant, unsatisfactory, and so on. So reality itself can be a hell of a thing to deal with, and therefore it's not surprising that people take refuge in complementary therapies and homeopathy and weird science and so on. Some people might add religion to that, other people wouldn't. You can dilute according to taste, as they used to say on the Ribena bottles, and so on. But the thing is, I'm pretty sure that if we're sort of prepared to admit to the messiness of things, you know, admit what reality, to a certain extent, what reality is actually like, I think that's the safest way, you know. But it does, you know, it does kind of require fessing up. I'm rather encouraged by the way in which, for instance, people in the last 5 to 10 years have started to talk about depression, for instance. and admit to depression and analyse depression, not overanalyse it, but really to talk about because that allows that people will sort of more readily, if you like, talk about the way in which life is. Another part of that may be the way in which we're now beginning right now to be more prepared to talk about the way we die. Which is also a kind of facing up to reality, which maybe hasn't been going on for 20, 30 years. That was a nice way to... Yes, let's stop on that cheery note. Death.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, James.